Hello there, and welcome to another episode of Sonya Maya's Psychology. This is a channel where I like to talk about psychology, relationships, sex education, and pleasure. So if you like this type of content, hit that like, hit that subscribe, turn on bell notifications. I post every Sunday. Today I want to talk about two things. First thing that I want to talk about is, does masturbating often with a vibrator numb out a woman's clitoris? Is there a numbing out sensation if, like, let's say you masturbate super often? That's going to be part one. And part two is going to focus on something I talked about last week, and I wanted to go into more detail about this, is this aspect of if you take a little bit of a break from masturbating as a vulva owner, a woman, someone with a vagina vulva, does this actually intensify pleasure temporarily? So let's get into that because they're similar topics, but they seem somewhat contradictory, and I will explain in a bit. So I have heard this myth, many myths, but one myth that I've heard regarding the clitoris is that there is something called dead vagina syndrome. And it's pretty much this idea that if you masturbate super often as a vulva owner, person with a clitoris, then you are going to dead out to your nerve endings. You're going to be numbed out and desensitized and all of these things. And that is just not true. This type of fear mongering is typically spread by people who don't understand sexual health and has this anti pleasure, anti masturbation, and sex mentality that I definitely don't believe in. It's very, like I said, fear mongery. And these people typically don't seem to understand they don't seem to understand the anatomy of female masturbation, orgasm, pleasure, or, anatomy in general. So I want to debunk that. It really reminds me a lot of the roast beef pussy myth, which I've talked about many times on TikTok, Instagram, and YouTube. It's this idea that if a woman has a lot of sex, that her vagina gets loose, which isn't true. I've talked about this many, many times, but that is where the roast beef pussy myth comes from in terms of like looking like roast beef after a lot of sex, which isn't true. And it also reminds me of when people say something like, oh, using lube means there's something wrong with you, or something like, people who use a lot of lube, you shouldn't have to, but that's not true because you can be very aroused and have a very healthy sexual life and still benefit from using lube. So here's why masturbating often is not going to desensitize you permanently. And I used to think that there was this thing called like a vibrator addict, where it's like you do it so often that it's going to desensitize you and that you should take a break from using a vibrator. And I no longer believe that because I have learned since then about the anatomy. The clitoris has about 10 to 15,000 or more nerve endings or nerve fibers. It is the most dense organ when it comes to nerve endings in terms of the amount of nerve endings in one spot. And I've talked about so many times, the clitoris is the only organ whose sole purpose is pleasure, which I think is amazing, which is why I call it the magic conch sometimes. And guess what? These nerve fibers are extremely resilient, just like you. So obviously, if you're masturbating a lot, using a vibrator a lot, and you're in pain or there's discomfort or there's a certain toy that you don't feel good using, then take a break, switch it up. That's totally fine, but it's not going to numb you out. So basically, think about it like this. When you use a vibrator often, there is going to be a temporary aspect of your nerve endings getting overstimulated. So therefore, can feel less sensitive or numbed out over time for about a day or so, is what I'm seeing in the science. It's very similar to, let's say you are working out and you are doing some bicep curls, and then you notice that your arm is feeling kind of fatigued for a day, yeah, maybe sore, etc. But you know what happens? You feel better after you recover and you build muscle. I like to think of this as a similar analogy to using your nerve endings of your clitoris more often, because research shows that if you don't use those nerve endings, there's something called clitoral atrophy that can happen over time, which is, you don't want that to happen. It's like you don't use it, you lose it, so you lose sensation. Whereas if you masturbate often, you're more likely to aliven those nerve endings or nerve fibers, for lack of a better term, and therefore the association of your brain with that pleasure is more profound. So it actually helps heighten your pleasure over time. So it's similar to like building a muscle, The temporary muscle fatigue does not mean that your muscle is damaged or weakened in the long term, okay? The fatigue goes away. The more you train, the more those muscles become strong, just like with the clitoris. This is very similar. I can think of so many analogies. Think of it like sports, You play sports often, you are more likely to do better, right? If you learn a musical instrument, you're more likely to, over time, it's going to be better. So play your instrument for that better alignment with pleasure in your brain. So, bottom line, over time, consistent stimulation of your clitoris strengthens it. It does not desensitize or numb it. That is a myth. And if you're experiencing numbness over time, desensitization, and this is lasting multiple, like more than 2 or 3 days, definitely go to your doctor or OBGYN to figure out what's going on, because it's likely not your vibrator, it's likely something else going on. And take care of your health. You deserve it. So, this next part might sound a little bit like a contradiction, but it's not. What we just covered is using a vibrator often does not cause an actual desensitization over time. However, let's say you're trying to play around with improving your pleasure for a short period of time. Let's say you have a hot date coming up this Saturday with a play partner or with your actual partner or partners, and you want there to be more intense pleasure. Is there something that you can do? Will taking a short break actually help? Let's get into this, because I talked about this last week and I said I would go into the science a little bit more this week. So here's what we're doing. Given that we know, if you watch my videos, you know that our clitoris, sorry, I say clitoris because I have to moderate myself on other platforms, but I'm not doing that on YouTube. It may be true, yes, that the clitoris is the only organ whose sole purpose is pleasure. If I were to ask you which organ is the most important when it comes to pleasure, what would you think? What do you think? Did you think the noggin? Did your noggin think the noggin? Then you're correct. The most important sexual organ is your mind, especially as a woman, okay? And I'm going to talk about this more so you'll understand. Given the fact that that's true, dopamine plays a huge role. I'm going to expand upon what I already explained in this portion of the video. If you give your nerve endings a break down there, this can build anticipation, and physiologically, your nerve endings will go wild in a good way. Let me explain. Think about it like this. You know how your skin might be more sensitive to touch if it's been a while? Maybe it's been a while since you've had a massage. You go to get to a massage, it feels so freaking good. Or similar to an analogy I used last week, let's say you haven't had processed foods for a while, and then all of a sudden you have an apple, you have a bell pepper, you're like really, really hungry, and you haven't had processed, easy, fast carbs for a long time. And then you have something like a whole food. It tastes so much better. So, as humans, for a short period of time, if you abstain from something that really releases dopamine, like food that's really delicious, or sex, okay, or stimulation, then building that anticipation does improve pleasure temporarily. So this increases dopamine, and let me explain dopamine. Dopamine is often called the pleasure chemical, but what I want to let you know right now is that's not necessarily true. It's not the full story. Dopamine is more of an anticipation chemical. So when you anticipate something pleasurable, like thinking about that chocolate cake, you are releasing dopamine just fantasizing about the chocolate cake, okay? You are releasing dopamine just thinking about having the sex. It's that feeling of wanting, craving, building up excitement for something. So if you're masturbating regularly, which I do recommend on the regular, as a usual routine, right? Then your brain is getting used to the little hits of dopamine because it knows pleasure is coming. And that's healthy and that's normal and that's great. But we're talking about like an experiment here if you want to just see if it intensifies your pleasure. Like maybe your birthday's coming up, I don't know. So if you take a short break, I'm talking about a day or two, something interesting happens and your dopamine system starts building anticipation again and your nerve endings start going wild, okay? And I believe too that there's science down there of like just taking a little break off of the nerve endings. Ooh, it feels really good. So I think it's physiological and psychological, but in terms of the psychological, this is why sexting can be so healthy in long-term relationships, because it helps build anticipation. Also, words of affirmation and complimenting your partner or saying like, oh my God, I can't wait to like taste you in the morning. Like that can be so, so, so hot because of this reason. So if your dopamine is primed, you're more mentally turned on, and then your body's going to respond more responsively, if you know what I'm saying. And especially for women, arousal is a very dependent on the context, the anticipation, like, foreplay, texting, time of the month, of course, because, if you're ovulating, you're going to be hornier, stress levels, attachment, as I've talked about before, people who are securely attached. If you want more info on attachment, let me know. I can make more videos about it. Secure and anxious attachment, they're more likely to have an orgasm in long-term relationships, whereas people who are avoidant are more likely to have an orgasm in one-night stands, for example. So attachment, increased lubrication, and sensitivity, like we discussed already at the beginning of the video. So more desire with time builds blood flow to that area, and the engorged clit, more blood flow, means more sensitivity. It works the same way in men. Anticipation equals more arousal, but one interesting caveat with that is that if a man takes a 2 to 4 day break from any ejaculation or masturbation or anything, then his sperm quality actually increases. I am not a fan of like no nut November or abstinence or any of those types of things. However, if you are trying to get somebody pregnant consensually, of course, in a smart and mindful and intentional way, then take a break, yes, for 2 to 4 days, and then that ejaculate is going to have higher quality sperm, which I think is really interesting. But yeah, of course, there might be more anticipation and therefore more dopamine release and therefore more pleasure for men too. So this applies to taco and burrito owners. Clitoral sensitivity is more nerve based though, because like I was talking about with the nerve endings with the clitoris, when it comes to ejaculation volume, that's more anatomy based, but the pleasure and the dopamine is pretty similar, if that makes sense. I just want to say too, like the longer the better. Not the case when it comes to either side. So for men, if like 7+ days is not going to increase your sperm quality, but I would say for both men and women, anyone, 2 to 4 days is a great break in order to take advantage of this pleasure-based science. But yeah, if you want to play around with this, abstain for sexual pleasure to increase that intensity, it's really your choice, your body, your rules. I hope you learned something new in this video. And I do post videos every Sunday. Again, I am Dr. Sonya Maya, a psychologist, sex therapist, and clinician. So if you like content like this, make sure to stick around. Hit that like, hit that subscribe, turn on bell notifications, and comment below if you have any topic requests or if anything stood out in this video. And yeah, I try to make you laugh while learning. So I hope that you like my sense of humor, because when we're laughing, when we're learning, more dopamine, but also more likely to store it in our long-term memory, which is going to be better for pleasure. So everyone make pleasurable decisions and decisions because you deserve it. And I will see you next week for another video. Goodbye.